All right, so Unit 6 is about the antebellum period and the um, abolition movement and the Civil War. So the Compromise of 1850 was proposed by Henry Clay, and it solved the admission of California into the Union as a free state, and it dealt with the territory that we got from Mexico in the Mexican American War, um, and slavery was banned in D.C., and they had a more strict fugitive slave law, and it was also known as the Bloodhound Law. So, abolitionists, there were lots of abolitionists thanks to things like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which was a fictional account of slavery in the South. Um, but you had one of the most famous abolitionists was a militant abolitionist named John Brown, and so the North saw him as a martyr, where the South saw him as a madman. He's most famous for a couple of different things: the Pottawatomie Massacre, in which during Bleeding Kansas, he killed by hacking to death pro-slavery settlers in Kansas. But his most famous would be in October of 1859. He and his sons wanted to start an armed slave rebellion, and so they went to the Federal Arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, to try to take the weapons that were there at the Federal Arsenal and give them to slaves so that they could start a rebellion. And it did not go as planned. The slaves were like, no, don't think so. And Robert E. Lee, who was a part of the Union military at this point, was one of the, along with Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart, who will all eventually be Confederate soldiers. They arrested Brown and his co-conspirators, and they were tried and hung for treason. Kansas-Nebraska Act actually predates John Brown, but this is the trying to figure out how we're going to bring Kansas and Nebraska into the Union, and they determined popular sovereignty. They got to decide, and so now they start fighting, and this becomes Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery versus anti-slavery, and they're literally killing each other, i.e. the Pottawatomie Massacre. The Republican Party is born in 1854, and so it is a whole bunch of small leftovers from other parties, like a little bit of Whig, a little bit of Free Soilers, a little bit of the Know Nothing. So all these small parties that were little bitty parties came together and formed what will become the Republican Party, and their big platform was opposing the spread of slavery, not the abolition of slavery. And that's the thing people seem to kind of miss. The Republican Party wanted to stop slavery from spreading because Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided against itself will not stand. They were just trying to prevent, and then they were going to address slavery a little bit later on, but they just didn't want slavery to expand into any new territory that we got. So things like Kansas and Nebraska, they didn't want that happening anymore. So the election of 1860 was between John Breckinridge, Stephen Douglas, so Northern Democrat, Southern Democrat, Abraham Lincoln, who's a Republican, and John Bell, who's a constitutional Union. And the Democrats probably could have won this had they not had two different candidates. So they had a Southern Democrat and a Northern Democrat. So Abraham Lincoln carried the 1860 election. He's the only person in American history to win without receiving one single solitary Southern vote. So this will effectively start the Civil War, because the South believed, because of their stance of not allowing slavery to spread, that they would start coming for their slaves. And so South Carolina was the first to succeed, and then all of the others will succeed. So here are the Union states, and these are border states that did not succeed. So Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri did not succeed, and so these succeeded before the fall of Fort Sumter. So we are here in Alabama, and then these all succeeded after Fort Sumter. So military advantages and disadvantages. The North had industrial powerhouse. They had a lot more people. They had better transportation. So they were a lot better off financially, militarily. South, we were fighting a war of attrition in the South. The South wasn't trying to go to the North and attack them. They just wanted the North to stay out of the South. That was all. So it wasn't like they were trying to take common ground. They had established their own government. The first White House of the Confederacy was here in Alabama in Montgomery. So they were not trying to infringe on the North. And again, their biggest advantage is their leadership. Robert E. Lee was a West Point graduate. He was, one of the greatest military minds in American history. He understood battlefield strategy like no others. There are a lot of important battles in the non-American Revolution, the Civil War. If you click on this tells you more about some of those battles. Fort Sumter is the first battle that starts the Civil War. Antietam is the bloodiest single day in the Civil War, and both the Union claimed victory, but most kind of believe that neither really won. Gettysburg was a decisive Union victory, but it had high casualties. And it was a turning point in the Civil War, and it was after this that Lincoln gave his famous Gettysburg Address. But this effectively will put the nail in the coffin of the Confederacy. And this was Sherman's march through Georgia. And so Lincoln reportedly won. So Lincoln has just been reelected to his second term in December he got reelected in November of 1864. And so he gave Sherman his marching orders. He wanted to take Georgia. Georgia was the last Confederate stronghold. And so William Tecumseh Sherman's job was to take Georgia. So he marched a 50-mile wide path of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah. So they see how it's 285 miles this way, but they spread out this way from here to here, soldier to soldier, and just marched. And while they're marching, they're tearing down telegraph wires, and they're tearing up railroad ties, and they're burning down bridges, and they're just complete and total scorched earth, destroying everything in this path so that the South will have nothing left. And so it's reported that when he gets to Savannah, he sends a telegram to Lincoln that says, "I got you, Georgia. Merry Christmas." Lee surrenders to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, effectively ending the Civil War. And unfortunately, Lincoln will be assassinated within 2 weeks of this by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in hopes of restarting the Civil War. During the Civil War, Lincoln does write his Emancipation Proclamation, in which he declared all slaves in the Confederate States free. This did not free slaves in the border states or any other the states that were not in rebellion. So only states that were in the Confederacy. And the problem with that is those states didn't recognize him as their president. So it was just a piece of paper. But what it did do is that as soon as the Civil War was over, it paved the way for the 13th Amendment, which did abolish slavery.